ready to go! You're listening to By Land and by Sea, powered by the Maritime Professor. Well, we had a different episode planned until about an hour ago. The White House just dropped the most comprehensive maritime industrial policy document that we have seen in decades. So now we're going to talk about that today. And you know what? Even better, I'm not going to do it alone. Today I'm going to be joined by Caitlin Hardy with Nessie Consulting, and we're going to be breaking down the newly released, you might not even have even heard that it came out, America's Maritime Action Plan. This is the Maritime Action Plan that we've been waiting on. Was it due in November? You know what? There's been a few government shutdowns. We're happy it's here. We're going to be talking about what's structural, what's market moving, what this means, what it will continue to mean. It's probably going to be a topic of conversation at TPM in 2 weeks. And look, if you work in ocean shipping, if you're even casually interested in maritime, this document will change the conversation. You got to know about it. Hi, welcome back to By Land and by Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor, former FMC International Affairs attorney, and founder of Squall Strategies. By Land and by Sea is your go-to resource for navigating the regulatory side of global ocean shipping. And me? Well, I'm your favorite maritime attorney, aren't I? As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. There is no attorney-client privilege created by this video or by this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So let's get into it today because, as you know, ocean shipping moves the world. And today's Maritime Action Plan is about everything maritime. This document lays out a few different pillars. We have Pillar 1, rebuild U.S. shipbuilding capacity and capabilities. Pillar 2, reform workforce education and training. Pillar 3, protect the maritime industrial base. Pillar 4, national security, economic security, and industrial resilience. And then 2 additional categories of deregulatory actions and implementation of potential legislative proposals. All right, well, help me welcome Caitlin. Let's jump right into it.
Hi, Lauren. How's it going?
Good. How are you? Thank you so much for jumping on, like with zero notice, basically.
No, I think we were both probably texting each other at the same time when we saw the announcement this morning and had the wild hair to hop on. So
That's right. Well, we can nerd out completely on this document. Before we get into it, though, can you introduce yourself, your company, and your background, and then we can just start giving our initial impressions.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Hardy. I'm the founder and managing director of Nessie Consulting. We work with a lot of startups in maritime, ocean, and defense tech from MVP to commercialization. Work with a lot of companies and organizations abroad, primarily in NATO, to bring their technology to the U.S. shipbuilding market. And my background is as a naval architect, trained in undergrad, worked for a consulting firm for naval architecture firm for a few years. Then moved over to the new vessel construction side and the salvage side. So for me, I've worked across a lot of different commercial verticals and then came back to the shipbuilding side, but from an OEM perspective, worked for the largest maritime OEM in the world. So to see sort of all those different veins in here is certainly something that I'm excited to talk about today.
Perfect. Well, that's where my script ends, and we're just gonna jump into it, I guess. All right. So, America's Maritime Action Plan. It literally dropped. I mean, what about like 12:30 Eastern time? So we've had about an hour and a half, but really probably 30 minutes of real dedicated time with this. So I do want to give the qualifier. You know, we decided that this was going to be a good idea, perhaps against our better judgment. But what we wanted to really do was just kind of give our initial impressions. You know, we haven't had a lot of time with this, but from your shipbuilding background and my commercial side of the industry background, we thought that maybe there might be some value to the things that we find interesting and maybe kind of talk about it in real time. And hopefully you find that interesting as well. This is probably going to be one of the first and best opportunities for, if you are listening live, if you are in either YouTube, X, or LinkedIn, feel free to comment. I can see the comments. This is going to be a wild new thing for me, but we will, depending on how it kind of works into the conversation, we'll be monitoring that. So, all right. So let's jump right into it. So overall, what do you think? Are you mostly positive, a little bit concerned?
Overall, I am super excited. I mean, again, you said, you know, we've both looked at this maybe half an hour to an hour. The takeaways I'm excited to see. So when we think about the executive order, when it came out, there were a lot of different items listed. And so to know that the Maritime Action Plan was going to go into all of those, and there's definitely some new things that seem to be added and flushed out here. So initial impression is there's some things where it's like, oh, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more, like for maritime prosperity zones. But then there's other areas where it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting to see this. I think the other piece that is, incredibly meaningful for sort of where we are in this moment is the Maritime Action Plan is dropping just on the heels of Davy's award to build 2 icebreakers in Finland and build 3 at their yard in Texas that happened earlier this week. So we're starting to see a lot of movement, and certainly, the public-private partnerships as well as working with our allies outside of the US is becoming more and more real. We're shifting away from just having it be conversation. And I'm hoping that this action plan will be more than just conversation and, a continued pattern of moving towards action.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And, the other thing that I'm really, really there were signals here and I was starting to get a little bit cautious and nervous, like maybe I shouldn't be reading these signals here, but we finally have the leadership installed in some of these key maritime roles. We have Steve Carmel in the Maritime Administrator position. That was right around Christmas. Chairman Laura DeBella of the Federal Maritime Commission, she was installed. We're still waiting on the 5th commissioner, but to me, it always felt like we were waiting on these leadership positions to get in place before we could have our watershed moment. And so, about a month, right? That we've had, not even a month. I mean, a few weeks. So
right.
I think we're going to
the
start
confirmation
moving
of the Commandant of the Coast Guard, right? Like it's
That's
all
right.
slowly starting to come into fruition.
That's right. And I feel like the maritime industry can be a little jaded, right? We can be a little like, oh, okay, you promised us the world last time. We'll see. But this is feeling good so far. So, and I agree with you. I think that there are some areas that, and I don't want to be too critical, right? Because we're just looking at it, but there's some really innovative ideas that don't have a lot with them in this document yet. But also, I like that there wasn't a self-censor to that where it was like, let's just put it out there and see where it goes. And I guess that's the prosperity zones, I think, is something that's been kind of talked about a little bit since that executive order in April. There wasn't a ton more here, but that's also fine. There was enough, right? And there were some kind of building blocks that they want to build from. So, yeah.
Cool. Shall we dive in?
Let's do it. All right. Let me see where I put some highlights. All right, the first pillar here, rebuilding U.S. shipbuilding capacity and capabilities. Right off the top, so the way that they structure this is they have some bullet points, they go into some kind of overall thoughts, and then they have some actual, recommended policy actions. So the bullet points that I like to see off of this, right, we were talking about the maritime prosperity zones, but then also the incentivization, the incentivizing things. Here it says incentivizing investment in U.S. shipyards. I think that that's going to be the difference. So we've always had kind of an effort of fostering through subsidies, perhaps, of the maritime industry. And while that has worked, I also think that it hasn't totally worked, right? We're not in this position because everything that we've done has worked. And so we need to have a little bit more. I like to see the incentivization because for me, from a commercial standpoint, it feels like then it creates that market driver, which has long-term potential instead of just we got to have money to give to it. You know what I mean? It can be both, but what are some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about every commercial vertical of maritime in this plan being impacted, right? And then the military and adjacent, white holes as well. One of the pieces that jumped out is, on the expand shipyard capital improvement financing, it talks about the $2.6 billion that currently exists in vessel owner funds and how that is going to be extended to shipyards. So I'm really curious to see okay, and, what's the mechanism that's going to follow there? For these long-term investments. I think it's also good to see, the initial language, which is not rocket science or a surprise, but expanding the small shipyard program to medium and large size shipyards as well, right? Because those are really everyone needs it right now. But for, a lot of the scope and the length of vessels that we're talking about, those aren't the ones that are being built in these small yards. That's one of the first things that's identified is I think 8 yards that can build, vessels that are 400 feet or longer in this country right now. Which is certainly concerning. It's been good to see the small shipyard grants come out. I think those came out in the last couple of weeks as well for 2026. It moved from 8 million to 24 million, which still feels like a rounding error. But again, we're starting to trend in the right direction.
Yeah, and so I just want to kind of pause a little bit because a lot of my listeners might not be coming from the shipbuilding side of things. So right now, all that's available are small shipyard grants, but there isn't the same kind of grant support for the medium and large shipyards, and that's what's kind of a novel concept here, right?
Exactly. Yep. And
Yeah.
we've heard so much about public-private partnership, but I think where we've seen some of the struggles, we've certainly seen large investments from Hanwha to buy Philly Shipyard. They took a 20% stake in Austal down in Mobile. So that's the type of investment that I think the government's really been talking about. And especially from, a foreign ally for the Koreans, when we talk about MASGA, like what does that start to look like? And that's part of what this section is really
Yeah,
detailing.
that's right. And it's interesting too. There's one little part that talks about bridging solutions instead of kind of being the only way. And I think that that's what I'm seeing with some of that foreign investment. While it's fantastic, one thing that Sal Mercogliano has said is, let's not make it the Ships for Korea Act. Let's make it the Ships
Right.
for America Act.
Yep.
And I think that that's just a nice caution too. It's fantastic, right? We have to get off the ground. We have to get
It
moving.
is.
So the
But
external engagement and partnership is all critical to that. But keeping it kind of in this like bridging mentality so that, help us walk so that we can run.
right.
Well, I should
And
say like
I
help
think,
us sit up so we can
again,
crawl.
in the very quick time that we've reviewed it, for me,
Yeah.
that's the most meaningful line in the entire plan. Because when we look at the icebreakers and IcePac, the consortium between Canada, the US, and Finland at, sort of a State Department level, Homeland Security level, we are allowing ships to be foreign built for the first time. The difference there is that those are essentially warships. So, for Coast Guard, NOAA, and any, Department of War vessel, they're going to come under what's called Tollefson and Burns amendments. And so the president is able to give a waiver to that. But now we're talking Jones Act, right? If we're saying bridging, this document does not separate out commercial vessels in any way. And so that's going to require a waiver from Congress, right? An approval from Congress to say, for commercial fishing vessels, for instance, which is one that I've been really curious about and hoping to see in the background. Does that mean that we're building commercial fishing vessels of a certain class, right? How do we support the Bering Sea fishing fleet, which has vessels from World War II, but they can't afford to build new here? So how do we get those programs going? How do we get that, something else this plan calls out is like really down selecting into classes of vessels and accepted designs. And so I think that's something that's positive to see, both from a national security perspective, but also to your point of we're not going to Korea for forever. We're not going to Japan for forever. Here's how we're going to ramp up our flag and then bring this tech back home.
Yeah. And the secondary benefit of that is, and they talk about this kind of apprenticeship programs, we learn how to do it better, right? Because we don't really have the workforce. We don't have the workforce to sustain all of these great ideas that are being established. And so we need to learn from we need to expand those who know how to do this and can copy and paste all of these great ideas and bring them back stateside. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We just have to start building. And if that start building is because there's factories already established and shipyards already established, let's go there, learn how to do it, and we'll continue to do that, but then start tapering down and bringing it back home.
Exactly. And that's what we're seeing, right, with the LNG carrier that Hanwha is going to be building at Philly, or parts, or at least getting their workforce up to speed. A lot of that is taking place in Korea. So there's, a lot that relates back to USTR and the percentages of, our own exports that have to be carried on American vessels. One thing that was interesting, I can't remember if it was on the bridging line, but the only two foreign countries that I saw called out were actually as allies were Russia. Oh, this is what happens when you do these things quickly.
When we're doing it too fast.
I did call it Russia too for a different reason. But is Korea and Japan. And I think it's interesting to not see Finland listed, to not see Norway, some of the others. It doesn't mean that they're excluded, but I just think we look at the delegations that have been very public from our administration to go to, Asia over the last year, and how that's, changing how shipbuilding is viewed.
Yeah, that's right. And even Finland too. I think it was Maritime Academy that just just announced their big kind of partnership for apprenticeship program, which is fantastic for the cadets that go to Massachusetts Maritime Academy, that they'll get that expansion and knowledge on how to. I think it was welding. It was all things shipbuilding, right? And then bringing that back over and integrating that into the academy and into the program. So, yeah. Cool. I think this is great. Okay, create maritime. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go for it.
I was going to say create a maritime incentives coalition. So there were some kind of larger let's get groups together ideas, and this was one of
Mhm.
them that I saw. So it says a maritime incentives coalition comprised of federal agencies, state governments, and economic development organizations could serve to coordinate a site readiness and infrastructure offering that is tailored to shipbuilders. So that's on page 5. This one, I mean, Maritime Incentives Coalition, I think this also kind of speaks to I think you yielded some of your expertise for the Oregon Washington State
Mhm.
shipbuilding report that came out just last month. There was also the Michigan Maritime Action Plan or the Michigan Strategy that talks about kind of highlighting some of the benefits and components and different maritime elements in a supported by the governor way.
Right.
Action plan for Michigan. I think that other states are starting to prioritize maritime plans and create these documents that make them kind of ready in a collective statewide way that then will hopefully inform. I mean, it wasn't really talked about here in National Maritime Strategy,
Mhm.
actually, but I think that maybe this Maritime Incentives Coalition will help build onto
Yeah.
a National Maritime Strategy, and I think that's kind of what it's getting to.
No, I think it's great. I mean, incentives coalition, I struggle a little bit of like, okay, are they the ones coming up with what the financial mechanisms are? But even from a just grassroots effort, like we don't have a great way of connecting all the dots across our economic developers today,
Mhm.
right? Even within states, states are great at it, but across the country for shipbuilding. So I think to be able to say, hey, here's what's working here, here's how you cannot reinvent the wheel by the different types of training programs, trades programs that are there. The other thing with the economic development organizations that I've seen, even in Washington, is they want to be part of this conversation, but they're not sure how to get involved. And they have so many levers of their own that they're able to pull. And so I think that this could be kind of that connective tissue
Mhm.
that helps bring it back together.
Yeah, and I think that's right too, because even there were some reports. So I was on the Maritime Transportation System National Advisory Committee for the last charter, so it was 2022 to 2024. And some of the recommendations that we made in there, actually, a lot of the recommendations I was delighted to see had elements that were incorporated here. But one of the things that we identified were there were some reports that MARAD used to put out about shipbuilding, ship repair,
Mm.
just that could kind of track what we actually had from we can't build if we don't know what we have. And I kind of feel like some of this coalition grouping is kind of
Mhm.
getting to that, like you were just
Yeah.
speaking about, where we need to kind of know what we have already to build on, but we also need those simultaneous big ideas
Mhm.
that are continuing to build.
And I think that ties, for the economic development organizations and, state and local governments that are trying to figure out how to be part of this. One
Hmm.
of the great things that the Maritime Industrial Base, MIB or SIB under the Navy has done, but it impacts commercial as well, is trying to map like where are all the suppliers, right? If we go
Hmm.
all the way back down to metal, coming out of the ground, like who's involved? And I think
Yeah.
what they found that's, not necessarily surprising to me working with a lot of different component suppliers at different levels, but is that a lot of people don't even know where their end product is going. And so I think there's also this opportunity in this moment to, give a lot more mission and purpose for people's jobs to understand that like this widget is going on a ship that's going to do X, Y, and Z,
Hmm.
right? The other part that I think this Maritime Incentives Coalition, it looks like it's intended to do is for places that aren't traditionally on the East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, Great Lakes, and beyond, to be part of the maritime equation. When we look at
Hmm.
what's on the Mississippi, when we look at the access to barges on the inland rivers that we have, um, there seems to be a thread that flows through this document. And, if we sort of are moving towards the next section of the maritime prosperity zones, it talks about let's set up 100 of these. 100 is kind of an arbitrary number. In some ways, that doesn't seem like very many to me, given the fact that the Opportunity Zone program is so, so large.
Hmm.
And so I think that will be interesting to see how are those sort of divvied out? What is the size? Because that's not meant to just be a yard. It could be somewhere that's maybe helping build a module or a block, floating it down the river. Or it could be someone that is rolling steel, right? Or, a new propeller factory or something like that. Um, so I'm curious to see how that ecosystem begins to come together. And yeah.
Yeah, and I almost wonder too. So it's Maritime Prosperity Zone. So we're looking at if anybody's following along at home, page 6, where they start talking about strengthening interagency coordination, extend Maritime Prosperity Zone designations, expand geographic representation. I mean, so I've even heard when Maritime Prosperity Zones came out in the executive order that some of the ideas were like, can we have a Maritime Prosperity Zone in Iowa? And I think that the answer has to be yes, and I
Yep.
think that that's partly what they're
Yep.
getting to here. I also wonder, I mean, this is prosperity zones for shipbuilding investment, but also workforce growth. And so
Mhm.
some of the trade schools, right, perhaps
Mhm.
might also benefit. It might not
Sure.
just be the actual physical components,
Right.
but perhaps part of that maritime prosperity zone might be a new technical college, right, or a new technical
Mhm.
center that maybe is just dedicated to maritime welding. I mean, like I said, we just are looking at this, so we'd have to kind of read through it to make sure that that
No,
pairs up. But
it's
I think so.
and I think for me, I was disappointed to see the 100. Hopefully, that's something that's arbitrary, right? This isn't law, at least yet. The designation is for a period of 10 years, where I've always been curious about the maritime prosperity zones. Love the idea, but it's built on opportunity zones, which are not typically in disadvantaged communities. I think the language from the One Big Beautiful Bill, it's adjusted from 80% median income to 70%. So it's actually got harder to become an opportunity zone.
Mhm.
Well, maritime, if we look at traditional shipbuilding today, that's taking place in more expensive real estate, right? Anytime that you're on the water.
Mhm.
So I do think you make a great point for looking to places like Iowa. It's interesting as well that the territories are called out here, right? What could this
Yeah.
mean for, Puerto Rico is another great opportunity of where we already have a great presence, what we're seeing going on in the Caribbean from DOW and Coast Guard. So I think all of those are well positioned to, contribute to this ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right. So it says, ensure maritime prosperity zones geographically diverse, include areas outside traditional coast shipbuilding, ship repair, including river regions, the Great Lakes, Alaska, Hawaii, and U.S. territories, in addition to east and west coasts of the United States and the Gulf of America, account for Opportunity Zones 2.0 provisions set forward in One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So, I mean, yeah, I think that that's it. I mean, if you're listening to this from the middle of the country and you're thinking of ways to be part of the maritime conversation, I mean, that's a pretty great way to plug into it.
It is for sure. For sure.
I do, before we go forward, I want to go back one page to page 5, where it talks about establishing a universal fee on foreign built vessels from any nation entering U.S. ports. Now, I think that this is probably going to be one of those bullet points that will generate a lot of discussion. So
Mhm.
I'm just going to read it so that way we're kind of on the same page. Impose a universal infrastructure or security fee on all foreign built commercial vessels calling at U.S. ports, to be assessed on the weight of the imported tonnage arriving at the vessel. Now, they talk about a fee of 1 cent per kilogram on foreign built ships would yield 66 billion. A 25-cent fee per kilogram would yield close to 1.5 trillion. And they're saying that this could then potentially be used for the Maritime Security Trust Fund. Now, I see. So on the one hand, we're seeing some trade balance, and this is going to be supercharged. So I don't want. This is all just present impressions, right? This is all
Mhm.
just like quick
Yep.
snapshot thoughts. But 1 cent is, it doesn't seem like that much, right? And it's going to be based on the weight of the imported tonnage. And granted, this administration, they're working toward more of a trade balance. Anytime you put fees on top of imports, right, just as a general statement, are likely to end up with the consumer. 1 cent, right? It's probably going to end up being a minuscule thing. Um, but I think that that's interesting, and I think that that is I mean, we have to do this, right? We have to get money going into this Maritime Security Trust Fund, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We do need to get funds going for maritime generally. That this is an interesting concept, but I like that they start out with 1 cent, right? They
Mhm.
don't start out with $1 per imported
No.
tonnage, right? And even $1 wouldn't be that much, but just saying, even 1 cent could get 66 billion in
Mhm.
revenue, and it says over 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, we have some funds that are being shifted around to kind of be supportive of maritime. I think some of those trade tariffs are part of that pool of money that I have been hearing might be used. But then to have it have its own sustainability, right, and its own revenue generation mechanism, it's something to consider. Because I also think that the long term, right, maybe 1 cent doesn't change the needle right off the bat, but 1 cent for foreign built vessels versus U.S. built vessels, maybe it'll help incentivize um, vessel purchase orders, because
Mhm.
at least then you can avoid it, and maybe there's some market competition, competitive edge to saying, well, this is a
Mhm.
U.S. built vessel, so it
Right.
has zero tonnage taxes on it. I don't know. It's such a sensitive topic.
It is. I mean, I think we are. I'm out over my skis here. I'm definitely not the trade guru. Two things. One being like I'm Seattle based. I think to Vancouver, Prince Rupert, right? What are the
Mhm.
levers that start to push tonnage away from Seattle, Tacoma, Northwest Seaport Alliance, LA, Long Beach, same thing, right? It doesn't sound like saying 1 cent, right? You'd have to do the quick calcs to see like what would be the average,
Mhm.
fee that they're paying. The other piece of it, though, is I think it will take a long time, right? Shipbuilding is a long game. And
Mhm.
that's, I think, what's been hard about this is we've been talking so much about shipbuilding for the past year. We're starting to see really good movement, but this isn't something that we're going to resolve in 2 years. This is something that we're going to resolve over likely decades, right? We're going to start to see the fruits of our labor in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And so I don't want to say that it's presumptuous to put this in early, but it's going to take a while. Going back to, we only have a handful of yards that can accommodate the size of vessels that we're really talking about here on this fee.
That's such an important point, and it almost kind of makes that 1 cent more valuable, because 1 cent, maybe it won't be felt. And if it's kind of one of those, like, I don't know, like a retirement fund, right? Like it just
Yeah,
kind of keeps compounding and building, and maybe it just becomes this mechanism that grows into a kitty fund later, and that's the whole point, right? That's why they said in 10 years it'll be 60 billion.
right.
I think maybe that's why they said 10 years and not in 1 year we'll have 500,000 or something. It was like, no, we will see this over the course of the yeah, lifespan. So, all right. Anything else in this section that you want to call out?
I don't think so.
Okay. And again, this is like present sense impressions. This is just quick reactions. Um,
I mean,
the,
going, I'm page 6 really quickly on the
mhm,
supply and demand issues. Those are the ones that I need a little bit more coffee for.
mhm,
But I suspect they're very meaningful, right? You're talking a lot about
mhm,
the different financing mechanisms, the incentives. I start thinking a lot about what does this mean for flagging U.S. vessels?
mhm,
Are you bringing tonnage in from elsewhere? What does U.S. flag fleet growth mean as you get to page 7? There's also interesting threads of regulatory relief. And, there's a line I highlighted, reducing retrofit compliance frictions. So delinking US Clean Air Act requirements from the EIA PP certificate, which is around engines.
mhm.
So, kind of gets back to like the US on its own, if a vessel is just trading here, what does that mean versus we're ultimately trying to build a fleet if we're thinking containers, break bulk, etc., chemical that's trading all over the world. And so is that kind of a moot point because a vessel might not be accepted somewhere else? But it's interesting to see that type of language written in.
Yeah, and I also wonder too, and I don't do too much on the environmental side, but I almost wonder. I mean, some of the older vessels are kind of waved in because they were built pre
Mm-hmm.
environmentally related requirements. Would that happen, right? And kind of also taking, it's a little bit in a vacuum, right? Because there's also kind of a simultaneous international conversation
Yeah.
around all of this. But like, would you? It'd be interesting to see if a waiver would be granted on a vessel built after an environmental requirement, because
Mm-hmm.
obviously it was built after, right? And that was kind of, that's the whole, yeah. But I don't know. That'll be interesting to
Yeah.
see. The last point that's in this section before we move to pillar 2, um, is encourage bilateral and multilateral agreements. And this is where that bridge strategy comes up,
Mm-hmm.
where it says a potential bridge strategy provides a multi-ship buy wherein the first ships in the contract are built in the foreign shipbuilder's home shipyard, while concurrent direct capital investments are made in the U.S. shipyard they have purchased or partnered with to eventually onshore construction. That's what we're seeing in that Philly Hunwell shipyard, and I think that's what we'll see in other international partnerships. I think this is kind of speaking to Sal's caution, right? Saying like, let's not forget why we're doing this. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of, it feels like what they're saying. It is a help us crawl so we can walk, right? Help us get off the
Mm-hmm.
ground while simultaneously also investing in the US side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the trade aspect, which is always important. I know we each just came back from different conferences late last night. I was at West, largest naval conference on the West Coast, and everything for the last few years has been what if or when we go to
Mhm,
war, what does that look like, right?
mhm,
And so I really see the bridging strategy as necessary in
mhm,
order to begin getting tonnage so that we can even consider for the commercial side as well. There's a lot on the Jones Act side that might disagree with that. But if we are looking at this as a national security issue and a readiness issue, you sort of have to take your pick. So no, I agree with you on that. And, we started seeing signals from this administration. The first time I heard it publicly said was probably October. And I was a bit surprised because it wasn't, said from a warship perspective. It was said from shipping overall. And that's definitely where the nuances are.
Yeah, and that's, like you said earlier, right now, is it all of our military vessels are only built in U.S. yards, right? And that's why that's why we have a shipyard base at all, is because we have kept our military vessels domestic. And that's the whole point, is expanding that into the commercial side and just the capability and the capacity. Like the number of shipyards that we have out there can't support our goals, but this is what these incremental kind of things are building.
Right. No, I think since we lost a lot of I would call it like the last of the public yards in, the 90s, things have sort of stalled out. We haven't seen reinvestments in technology. Secretary of the Navy gave the keynote, I think yesterday morning at West, and gave an example of, like sailors will figure out how to get things done. Like Americans are scrappy. We will come up with a way. But sometimes it's not coming up with a way to get it done because it's like, what is the ROI or the negative on the backside? And so the, example was, I think it was a pier side crane that they had figured out how to make work, but everything else on the pier was just a nightmare. And it was slowing down the actual, turnaround time for bringing a vessel in, whether it's a wet dock or dry dock. And I think that's the point, is how can we start making those improvements and not just getting it done because we'll be able to increase our throughput.
Yeah. All right, let's go to pillar 2.
Can I just add, sorry, I just want to add one. This is going to take us forever, so maybe we won't do the whole thing. But maybe the second biggest thing I saw in this is on page 7, page 8, around leverage economic diplomacy and the agreement on reciprocal trade. So it says, to date, President Trump has secured at least $150 billion of dedicated investment for America's shipbuilding industry. Commerce is working to mobilize these funds to achieve the greatest investment in U.S. shipbuilding history. And so I think that's the only place I've seen so far where those funds are called out for. But I want to see, like, now where does that go? Like, we're talking about a lot of different loan mechanisms and the public-private partnership, but $150 billion on its own, when we're still talking about our small shipyard grants at $24 million, why haven't we done more with that yet? And so I'm happy it's here. I'm excited to see it here, but now let's make it happen.
And I think that's so right too. Talking about, okay, so it's only small shipyards. Well, that's not right. That's not enough. And then, we're talking about different, they're still like, they feel amorphous, these numbers, but like we are still talking about millions versus billions, right? With a B. And we need to be talking in the B billions, with some incentivization, with some good financing options, with all of that, because it's like you or I were to want to go into shipbuilding, right? American dream tomorrow. Like we couldn't, like we could maybe start a small shipyard, but even that would be, it just wouldn't have that. Yeah, it doesn't have that kind of element of mom and pop startup shop, which is a lot of these shipyards that are, that are kind of attached to families where they were a mom and pop startup and then they kind of built to what they are. I feel like, that's maybe a little bit more.
On the yard side and, the operating company side, I think about how many families, right, that are now multi-generational, and they started with one tug and they just kept adding over time. And that's really where I think the legacy for, the vessels in our class, in our flagged now come from.
And I think that's right too. We need to get the big vessels, right? And that's part of this. But I think that there's going to be some runway for people to enter into the market too. We can't solve all problems all at once, but we can try. All right. So pillar 2 is reform workforce education and training. I like to see this one because this starts talking about the Merchant Marine Academy, but then it also starts talking about the state maritime academies. I think some of the things that stood out to me right off the bat is one, obviously the Kings Point, right? The Merchant Marine Academy, the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy needs a lot of help. And so this starts to get there and it's like, let's just get it done. Let's just revitalize the Kings Point, which I think everybody basically agrees with.
I don't think anyone disagrees with that.
That's right. We're just doing it now.
We're doing it.
That's right. But the other things that I like seeing in here were expand mariner training and education. One of the things was data planning and reporting. Now this talks about mariner data tracking. So I'm sure the Coast Guard, through their Merchant Mariner Credential Program, has a certain kind of level of tracking of who they're giving credentials to, right? But like only kind of, right? Only kind of.
Yeah.
Just what last month, or maybe even just a few weeks ago, they opened up a system where you could then drop your documents on a link. You could upload them onto a website. That is when we talk about modernizing
Right.
the Merchant Mariner
Archaic
credentials,
infrastructure that
you
we're running
had to send them like physically in the snail mail. There wasn't an option. I think you could email attach them, but it
I
felt
and if you
maybe
could, that's only been recently, right? And
I
so
think
then
so.
you think
Yeah.
about the population you're talking about, and it's not
Mhm.
like these are desk workers. These are people who are in the middle of the ocean and then trying to keep their credentials up, right? So no, I'm
Mhm.
I'm with you. Seeing the modernization and removing a lot of the legacy challenges, like it's a no-brainer, and it's
Mhm.
great to see that this will have support. Now I just hope it's something that they can, execute on quickly, and there's a lot of great companies and people working on this one in the background.
Yeah, and the other thing too, they also say merit authorities to track the pool of mariners who are credentialed, actively sailing, and willing to sail in a national emergency. So I
Mm,
don't know if those, I mean, they're all separated by an Oxford comma, so presumably they're all separate credential, and then a category of actively sailing, and then
yeah.
a category of willing to sail in a national emergency. But I mean, when I got a 50-ton captain's license, it is a baby license. I had to swear in. I remember I had to oath in,
Yep.
which I think just assumes that, like, if I were called up, whether I was willing to sail in a national emergency or not, it didn't really matter. I think I was, right? I mean, I think that's what the oathing in, and maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking out of. Maybe I should look into this a little bit more before I speak about it, but more. But
Says
I
the
saw that and it was
but
interesting.
yeah.
So it was like, do you have to opt in now? I don't think so. I don't think that's what they're getting
Yeah,
to.
I haven't gone through that piece enough. I can't remember. It must be in a later section, but one of the things we briefly talked about when we spoke this morning was to see that the tax incentives that you won't be taxed when you're at sea for being in international waters.
Yeah.
That's huge, right? Like, let's look at the levers we can pull to keep people in our industry. And that's certainly one that it's not hurting the US at all to do that. We're incentivizing the people who are away from their families, who are at sea and gone for, months at a time.
Hmm.
The other one I was really excited to see, there's been so much talk about it, but military to mariner. Like, it's
Yes.
crazy to think that you can come out of the Navy and then struggle trying to capture your sea time. And so formalizing these types of programs, how does that trickle down then into, Department of War and Coast Guard,
Mhm.
and NOAA, to ensure that those credentials are tracked properly for later on, and, not losing that talent. That's one of the things that always makes me so sad. It's funny to me when I run into people and they'll be like, oh, like you're actually using your education. And I'm like, more of us should be using what our backgrounds are in. If you want to retire out, or it's your time to get out of the military and do something new, great, but there shouldn't be such a large barrier to entry. So it was nice to see that formalized here.
Yeah, I so agree. And that military to mariner, I mean, that's been in the works for at least 10 years. I remember when former Maritime Administrator Chip Janikin was working on that, and then Buzz was working on that, and it ended up going into effect. But exactly that, right? It's maximizing what they're saying here is maximizing credit for military training and sea
Yeah.
service. But military to mariner was created to be able to do it at all, because prior to that, it really wasn't an easy thing to use your sea time that
Yeah.
you had sailed the world, and none of it counted toward getting your 6-passenger fishing license,
I
captain, right?
exactly.
Like your 6-pack or your 25-ton or your 50-ton. You couldn't, and it was like, well, maybe you had even been on the bridge and you still couldn't, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, no, that I try to tell everybody who either tells me that they have kids that are in the military and they're thinking about getting into maritime later. Just, did you know this existed? Most
Right.
often, unfortunately, most often it's met with, I had no idea that was a thing. Like, oh man. I'd also want to call out the which one is it? Oh, maritime workforce recruitment and retention incentives. So I thought that this one was interesting too, because I think um, this is something that, and then regulatory and administrative simplification. So simplification. So it talks about student incentive payments, which would be used for, existing student incentive payments, which provide financial assistance to the state maritime academy students, tuition, training, and other costs associated with attendance. I don't think it was here, but there was another place where they talked about, so the NSMV vessels, all of these training ships that are going out to the Maritime Academy. So the National NSMV, National Multi-Mission, Security Multi-Mission Vessels. When they go out to the academies, one, I was surprised to learn that they don't get utilized as much as you think, right? They're sitting there waiting for alternative purposes because, and I say that because there's only a few sea terms, right? And you can't be on sea term the entire 365 days. And the other thing is, even though they're all, I think, and I don't want to speak for all of the maritime academies, but the state maritime academies, they're happy to receive them. They didn't come with fuel. They didn't come with any fuel costs. So now all of a sudden they have to pay the fuel of this giant vessel, which is great that they have the vessel, but it's also cost prohibitive. If they maybe didn't have a vessel or they had a smaller vessel before, now, the cadets that are going out to sea term have to pay I think it's pretty high amounts to even go out to sea term. So it's wildly valuable experience, but on the other hand, it doesn't really come with the support. And I mean, isn't that a statement on all things maritime? Great ideas, but they need the financial support.
Yeah, I mean, we finally have new vessels that they're working to get up to speed. But no, and two, you look at the model for Kings Point, and it's been forever since I've looked at the tuition side, but essentially you're going to school for free for a very small amount. The state maritime academies don't reflect that. And so how do we bring more alignment for what's ultimately, we look at KP as sort of the pinnacle. Have a lot of friends at different state maritime academies. They're incredible programs, but we should be providing access, I think, in a similar way to those students if we want to grow, and attract a workforce here.
Yeah. The other one that I want to call out in this section is the regulatory and administrative simplifications. And they talk about eliminating documents of continuity and the requirement to return expired merchant mariner credentials, so your captain's license. Now, this one's an interesting one to me because I keep talking about the boomerang effect that we see on the mariner side, right? So you have cadets that they get their unlimited tonnage while they're at school. They go out to sea. They're having a great time. They're making a ton of money, right? Not in all cases, but in general, that's kind of how it's been reviewed. You make a ton of money quickly. And then you meet somebody, you get married, you start having kids, and then you decide it's too much. You don't want to be gone that much. You want to stay shoreside. And you really, at that moment, have no intention of getting back out there. You're like, I'm done. No way. I'm shoreside. So you let your document lapse. And then fast forward 20, 30 years, you're kind of missing that adventure. Your kids are up and off, and you have this moment where you're like, I could go back out there, but I'm not exactly sure. Now, I don't know if that's what they're kind of getting to, this documents of continuity for the credential, or if it's more like, I'd like to know more here, I guess. This one I'd like to know more. Is this speaking to that boomerang effect, or is this more like this is just another piece of paper that we don't want to have people do? Because I think that if documents of continuity was a widely known, widely understood thing, and perhaps it is more than I know, but the people that I've talked to have said they didn't even know that was an option, and then others are like, well, I didn't know that. How did they not know that? If it's that simple and that's an easy, low risk way of keeping your credential, maybe we make that more of a priority when you're like, when you go to renew, right? You get your renewal notification. I think there should also be an option that says, would you like to just continue this? Would you like to step away for a while? Even when I renew my law license every year, it says, would you like to go into inactive status? And like, no way, I worked too hard on that. but I don't know. So that's,
but then at least you're staying engaged, right?
Yeah.
And you're aware of what's out there, and, maybe something changes where it's like, you don't want to sail full time or half the year, but maybe you're willing to take a few hitches a year, right? Like sort of this idea of currency. And, it's been a long time since I've been up to speed on the CFRs and that, but I'm curious to see what that means in the CFRs that they're looking to make modifications to.
I like it because I think that this will be important for capturing and keeping who we have, right? Because you don't forget how to ride a bike. And there's a parallel to nurses who, and I only say nurses because this is exactly the example that was given to me, where nurses let their license lapse during COVID because it was just, too much, and they decided they didn't want to go that way. There have been some efforts in certain states to find ways of boomeranging them back in to say, you didn't lose all your skills, you just took a little break. Can we
Right.
get you back up to speed without having you relicense the entire thing? So hopefully we'll see more there. Also, the very next bullet, page 10, training content and assessment flexibility, improve high fidelity simulator training to substitute for some portions of required sea service and allow to test out options for demonstrated competence. This might also speak to that boomerang where you could then test out, because I mean, especially at Mass Maritime Academy and probably other maritime academies, they have 360 simulators that you
Mhm.
literally can get seasick on because they are
Mhm.
so real that
Yeah.
that might be a way to kind of allow for, yeah, you're still good. You got it. Go get
Yeah.
them.
The other thing I hope that this will do almost inadvertently is increase the number of simulators that we have today. I don't know if we have a shortage, but like there's certainly a cost every time that you have to go to Maryland, every time you have to go to Seattle, right, to stay current, to go through those courses. And hopefully as we're adding mariners, that's also just adding the need for simulators. But that's such a great tool for our students to get while they are at the academies. And it's
Mhm.
something that's really missing. I don't think this document covers it. I might have missed it. But when we look at the academies, they really don't have what the cadets can expect to see on board.
Yep.
Now, if they're sailing on U.S. tonnage, maybe because our fleets tend to be older if we're looking at larger vessels. But for the most part, if they're going to a European company or, beyond, it is going to be night and day different. And so how do we better prepare them for what they're going to see and for the vessels that will eventually come out of the U.S. as well?
That's right. Yeah. No, I think that I think that's such a good point that hopefully this will increase the simulators. I mean, and they're cool. Like, I mean, at some point, the first time I went to go see the Mass Maritime Academy one, the only thing I could think of was like, they should have one of these in Disney World. Like,
Mhm.
this is so cool. This
Right.
should be a ride at Disney World. And like, wouldn't that be a amazing partnership if there was a whole Ariel's Under the Sea maritime world, right? That was maybe over I don't know, maybe it
I
was
think
going to
you're
be over at
coming up with an
Epcot.
idea for the Maritime Industrial Base right now that you can submit on their P3 portal. Reach out to Disney. Disney will do half the financing. The MIB will
That's
do the
right.
other to
Yeah. Let me
improve.
know when it's up. I'll go buy a ticket.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it.
I mean, well, I think we had just been there and they have some incredible rides down there, but I was like, we should have a maritime one. Like, we should have a maritime one. It could be over at Epcot.
Laura,
um,
we are only on page 13.
Oh my gosh,
We're not even
we gotta go through. We gotta cruise through. So obviously we're cruising through a part that says Kings Point. There's no discussion needed. Yes, more support for Kings Point. It's wild that it's where it is, but it is, and it needs to keep going forward. Let's increase support for mariner credential training. This is where it is. So on page 13, tax treatment of merchant mariner foreign earned income. That's where it says permit
Yeah.
the income of U.S. merchant mariners earned while employed on a U.S. flag vessel operating on an international route to be excluded from gross income. I mean, if you had tax-free income,
Mhm.
if you sailed on U.S. flag, I think that would
Right.
make a difference.
No, I know the mariners I've talked to. I mean, there's some of this now to a very small degree, but this makes it so much more clear. And it's incentivizing our mariners to stay within American tonnage, right?
That's right.
Which is also great. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
no,
and
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing too is, and this is maybe controversial, but our mariners are going out there, especially nowadays. Obviously commercial routes are being moved away from harm's way, but sailing is incredibly dangerous, and
Mm.
the academies are uh, they're conducted in kind of military methods that. Why don't we have veterans preference and why don't we have veteran status for mariners? I think that we should. I think that we should. I think that it would also help because it increases your available options once you come out, that all of a sudden you are more likely to get a U.S. Government job because you have that veterans
Yeah.
preference. And so it kind of helps just further appreciate, one, the Mariners and what they do, but then also uh, helps them with their career as they continue on.
No, for sure.
And that
Definitely.
was not listed in here. I should say that
No,
was not listed in here.
but there you go for
Um,
the next round, right? As this is
yeah.
further fleshed out. And yeah.
That's right. Okay, well, let's keep going. We have two more pillars, two more, I think, to get through. So, pillar 3, protect the maritime industrial base. High level things that you saw in this one.
Sorry, I'm gonna go back for just 1 second. Oh
Yep,
my,
yep, good. I
but
know
so
there's
hard.
so
Two
much.
really quick things. Page 13, just under the tax treatment, cultivate, expand, and retain a skilled maritime workforce. One of the pieces that doesn't show up, it's a smaller workforce, but still really important, is talking about naval architects. For me, that one's super personal. I know, though, there's a lot of programs that are starting in the background. There have been some recent changes with the DOW, with what schools they are, let's just call it friendly or not friendly to. And so I definitely have my own concerns of what have historically been really amazing engineering universities that could quickly get up to speed, but how that might be impacted in something like this. I also think we could talk a lot more about how are we pulling in like mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, adding into their curriculums, right? Even in places that don't have a full-fledged naval architecture program. And then kind of related to something you were talking about earlier for the mariners, but for the shipbuilding workforce, when we think about fabricators, welders, it was one example. They talk about providing federal housing loan guarantees, which that's the first time I've heard of this. Very similar to a VA loan if you were a military veteran. So I think that's really interesting for a military veteran. Usually you can put like 0 to 1% down. So that could certainly be an incentive for someone. The other piece is they talk about integrating shipbuilders with a Navy Reserve to create a reserve force skilled in ship repair, with reserve unit drill benefits to the shipbuilders. So I'm curious what that means of like, working through the weekend, or you take a special 2-week tour maybe to another yard to cross train. But to also have that extra little bit, of pay seems like a great idea.
Yeah, or maybe even kind of, really parallel it with reserves, where you might just go work a non-shipbuilding engineering job, but you have shipbuilding experience, and you get uplifted, right, as part of a 2 weeks a year, 1 weekend a month, which also further kind of solidifies if this is a national strategy, a national essential military piece. And I don't want to minimize it, but I think that there should be some veterans preference for some of these workers if they are a priority in our national security.
Sure. No, I completely agree. All right, pillar 3.
Okay, pillar 3. Okay. One thing that I want to call out right at the beginning, recommended policy action, institute a new United States maritime preference requirement. It says, as ships are being built in the United States, require high volume exporting economies to transport a gradually increasing percentage of their U.S. bound containerized cargo on qualifying vessels. I'm interested to see how this one develops. There's a lot of different things that go along with this, but basically they're saying high volume exporting economy. So other countries that are sending their goods to us, so essentially U.S. imports, they're saying they're going to require high volume to gradually increase percentage on U.S. bound. I don't know what the mechanisms for enforcement would be for that and what it'll look like, but an interesting concept, right? This kind of speaks to I want to see commercial incentives. This feels a little bit more like commercial penalty, but it'll be interesting to see how this goes along.
It will. I wrote on those, I circled all 3 bullets for the recommended policy actions. And I was like, need more time to review. And I just wrote, it seems really loose. And I underlined it because, to your point, like I want to see more details of what that looks like.
But I mean, that's the thing. We need to have mariners. We need to have vessels. We need to have ports to receive them. And none of it works if we don't have cargo to move them. And so, while we can be building all the military vessels that we want, we don't always need military vessels all the time. And if we want to get the commercial fleet that can then be uplifted, the commercial fleet needs something to do. And so we need the cargo for that. The land port maintenance tax fee, this is something that the harbor maintenance tax, this is the loophole, actually closing the loophole. This is something that was in the executive order that came out in April and was supported by some of the FMC commissioners, saying we got to return to this loophole because your point of cargo diversion and going to Prince Rupert and other ports and moving away from the Seattle Tacoma and Northwest Seaport Alliance or any kind of border area, this will help close that because it's an ad valorem tax. So it's an actual tax based on the value of the goods. And so get a high enough value good, and it's kind of, it makes a lot of sense. It can make some financial sense depending on what your metrics are to go away from the U.S. Right. So this will help close that loop.
Right. No, that's great.
Enhanced competition in shipbuilding. I think those are all right. I mean, that's just good things anyways. I'd like to see more on that. Rewarding performance, timely delivery, cost-saving innovations, life cycle support commitments, and kind of the communication. I think we talked about this a little bit right before we were going on. Communication, right? Sometimes this industry feels like it's working a little bit in the dark, not on purpose, but having a little bit more visibility into how it works.
Right. I think, when you look at this, so it's government procurement efficiency. We're on page 16, if you're following along. This is everything that every single yard and, owner has been asking for. If we're talking, for vessels that the government is committing to, it's, it says by committing to multiple hulls at once. And that seems so obvious, but, that's not necessarily the way that this has always been done. Streamlining the acquisition process. There's a lot of talk about vessel construction managers. Another word for that is an owner's rep. It's a really successful model. I have seen some of the shipyards kind of, not be thrilled that they're dealing with VCMs, or just they don't always see the need if they feel that they have people in their yard to be accountable. But when I look at this from a private, capital market, it's completely different. You would never build a vessel without having someone representing you on site or checking in to make sure that it's being done in the right way. But I think the piece that most stands out to me, there's a lot here, is with the exception of warships, use designs of existing mature or modular commercial or government vessels that can be adapted, and it goes on from there. So we're talking about using commercial designs that are repeatable, but then they talk a couple sentences down. It says the government should retain intellectual property as an element of shipbuilding contracts to preserve the ability to maintain and modernize platforms over time, ensure operational independence, blah, blah, blah. And so I don't think that naval architecture firms or shipyards that have their own engineering staffs, HHI is a great example. They're doing a full, engineering firm in-house versus US, where we frequently use separate naval architecture firms that are then partnered with the yards. But what is the premium the government is going to pay? I'm not against this, but it's, to give up your intellectual property, you're basically saying the government can post this on sam.gov, and whoever the lowest bidder is maybe the one that gets a contract. Here's all the, the drawings and designs. And so it's the first time I've seen this show up in, one of these documents. I'm just curious to learn more.
Yeah, I think obviously the intellectual property. I mean, there's also another section in here that says increase use of emerging technologies and really kind of lean in on that side of things. We can't have both, right? We can't say that we're leaning into new technologies, but then also saying, but we're going to give it to everybody else, right? And that's something that the U.S. has always been, as an international perspective, against. And so I think that's a tender balance. One that I hope we get right, because we, like I said, as the U.S., we tend to be very sensitive to being required on the international stage to give over, new technologies. So,
Exactly.
good point. There is a section that I just want to mention that they talk about actions in the investigation of the People's Republic of China targeting maritime logistics and shipbuilding. They kind of said that it was a success having the hearing and continuing on there, and that they're going to continue to actually, it says consult with China on shipbuilding capacity issues. So I think that that's going to be interesting. And this is where you said that they talked about Korea and Japan on the shipbuilding. Yeah. Anything else in this pillar? We're running quickly out of time.
We're quickly out of time. I think we can move on. We can move on.
Perfect. So pillar 4, national security, economic security, and industrial resilience. It talked about supply chain resilience and domestic capacity for critical components and reduce sole source dependencies. I think you kind of spoke to this earlier, where we have to get a better supply chain system and know what we have and how we can move it all around and how it all works together. And this is where it feels like it's talking about that original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, and finding ways of better managing that, I guess.
Yeah, I think for me, what I really want to see, I'm looking at page 21, increase domestic capacity for critical components and reduce sole source dependencies. I think it's so easy when people are new to shipbuilding or, new to maritime, to look at it and just be like, it's all just about the hull. And I think we've talked about this before. Like, it's just about welding steel together, but it's all the guts that go inside. And very little of those guts are actually coming from the US. And that's really what this section is focusing on. So, talking about propulsion shafts and propellers, like I can list on one hand, the number of foundries in the US where propellers are being done today. Like that's a huge, point of failure that we have as a country. We have a lot of amazing, partners and OEMs that are coming from abroad and working to come here. But they need those demand signals that it makes sense for them to make an investment. And I think there's a lot of big OEMs that are willing to make the investment, but the demand signal has not been strong enough to say this is actually going to happen. And even at West, one of the things that I'm still struggling with very much is, this is more from a Navy perspective, but is saying, talk to VC, talk to venture capitalists, get money. If you build it, we will come. And I just don't think that's realistic. I think it's also that typically VC is willing to take a risk because it's an exquisite solution. And not everything we need to do here is an exquisite solution. In fact, everything is quite the opposite. Most of this has been done before in other nations, just not necessarily here.
Yeah.
And so you're probably not going to see a VC investing in, a propeller foundry. You could look at any of these, talk about high strength steels. How are we making improvements there? Advanced electronics, we can certainly leverage some of the work that has been done around the CHIPS Act and, things of that nature. But I worry that we don't have, until the demand signals are in place for things just beyond the yards, that it's not flowing down to those next tiers yet.
Well, that's, something that, so I was just at Manifest for the week, and supply chain innovation, supply chain technology, it was all modes. So maritime, is part of the conversation, but it was all modes. But one thing that we saw a lot in the maritime side was we saw a lot of innovation and digitalization and, kind of moving forward on that. We saw a lot of Silicon Valley move into maritime when the maritime conversation got heated up, which is fantastic. I love it. I want to see more of it. We don't have the same manufacturing side, right? General manufacturing saying,
Yeah.
cool, let's move to maritime. So we had a couple really good conversations where, yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. Like, let's move manufacturing over, like, because we're in the trucking world and some of these things can be replicated, right? I mean, you might not know how to make a full propeller, but like there might be some simplicity there that might actually lend itself to an easy update to ability from other manufacturing sectors.
Sure. No, for sure, right? I mean, we have a lot of we build a lot of automobiles in this country.
Mhm.
Like, how are we, leveraging them? So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so establishing a strategic commercial fleet, this is something that I have been yelling from the hills, that we have to have a commercial fleet here. We have to have it. We can't just have, we certainly need more continued support and more support for military, but we have to have a commercial fleet. Perhaps the commercial fleet can be ready to uplift. I mean, that's one thing about all Chinese vessels is they are all ready to be militarily uplifted if needed. So, you think about the vessels that are coming in and just part of our containerized cargo movement. Those can all be military vessels. Perhaps we get there with our commercial fleet, but we just need a commercial fleet at all, right? So that's where I'm really kind of focused and interested.
yeah, no, it's a start, right? It's a start. And then great to see for Maritime Security Program and TSP Tanker Security Program being
That's right.
funded. Like, what does that actually mean? But yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is your pièce de résistance, the Arctic. We're cruising into the Arctic section
We
here.
are, and like right before the Arctic, I'll just say really quickly, I wasn't expecting to see anything around autonomy. It talks about robotic and autonomous systems. So I think that's really curious. The other thing that surprised me a bit, maybe I shouldn't have coming from West this last week, is leveraging proven private sector designs. And so again, going back to this exquisite versus proven before, the unmanned space, uncrewed space right now for USVs, ASVs is very, this of everyone is saying they're bringing something new. You've never seen anything like this before. And then, I have great feelings towards Dahmen. They build amazing vessels. But we see a ton of Dahmen designs, right? We're seeing designs that we've seen before and it's not necessarily changing. So again, this ends, the priority should be on existing industry designs. But moving to the Arctic side, there is a lot here that I was not expecting to see. One is talking about similarly, the expansion of sustainable Arctic fisheries has the capability to bolster commercial production. I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Bering Sea fishing fleet is a range of ages. It's been years since a new vessel was built, and then a couple of years since a new vessel was built. Arctic Fjord was the last beautiful vessel. Thomas C. did an incredible job for Arctic Fjord. But before that, there really haven't been any. It's a huge, huge challenge. So is there an opportunity here when we go back to talking about bridging to maybe build commercial fishing vessels abroad and bring that back here? Because we know that the Russians are fishing a lot of times illegally, and that's undercutting the prices that we're able to offer. The U.S. fishing companies are doing everything they can to squeeze, their operations in a safe way, but ensure that they can be competitive in the market. And with what's happening from, some of these other nation, actors, that's not the case. Another piece in here that's really interesting. I'm glad to see so much talk about Alaska and making improvements there. That's been a long time coming. We know that the Port of Nome finally got funding for some of their pier. We know that there's been a lot of movement for Coast Guard on Kodiak. But this talks a lot about modernizing the aging infrastructure in Alaska and Greenland. which we'll be curious to see, how that all comes together. But two of the parts here that surprised me most that I didn't expect to see, because I'm thinking like maritime action plan. This is
Yeah.
very like getting vessels on the water, but it's talking about improving domain or maritime domain awareness. So really the intelligence of the data collection, who else is out there, what's going on. And so I was curious to see that. The other piece that they go into is expanding seabed activities.
Yeah.
So the High Seas Treaty has been ratified now. The U.S. is not a signatory. It will be interesting to see, the U.S. had originally been part of writing a lot of that language. But what does that mean for deep sea mining? So there's a line in here that says, partner with Arctic allies to develop seabed mineral resources in the areas within their national jurisdiction, not ours, positioning U.S. companies to support mining efforts. Well, Canada, large Arctic nation, currently does not allow deep sea mining. Norway has a moratorium until 2029. So I'm just curious to see how that will all begin to, come together. And with the U.S. not being a signatory to the High Seas treaties, where a lot of the deep sea mining conversations are happening, I could see the potential for a lot of international sort of headbutting to come to fruition there.
Yeah, I see a lot of Greenland signaling with that expanded seabed activities, right? Because it says partnering, right, with the Arctic allies. And so, in the art of the deal, right, it's the overshoot and then it's the negotiate somewhere within. And so perhaps we, I don't want to go too far into geopolitics, but perhaps we don't take over Greenland, but perhaps it just becomes strategic partnerships. This feels like it's part of perhaps a larger plan there.
Sure. I mean, I think this is saying we're going to, go back to using the base that we have there, at a higher frequency, improving in the infrastructure that's there. Improving, I mean, this talks about our infrastructure at large, for what we have primarily in Alaska, which, is fantastic. They also talk about energy development opportunities, talking about Alaska LNG. This has been going on for years, right? So what does that look like as an asset to the U.S. here? And, when I look towards Alaska right now, that's a huge opportunity for all of the Jones Act operators. Crowley and Toad are both up there already now delivering a lot in the way of fuel and food and everything, that you see on the shelves. So to see further development for some of these ports that are smaller today, I think is exciting.
Is there anything that we missed a lot? We
missed a lot.
I think we've been talking about it for longer than it's actually been out. So that I would say that this was a successful test of let's just do it, right? No, I really, what I was kind of thinking here, and I think what we were both thinking was, we're going to talk about it anyways. We're going to nerd out on this document. So why don't we let, fly on the wall activity happen here? And so, that's what I hope our listeners really appreciated the conversation. Is there anything else that you want to bring up that we definitely missed? I mean, I think that there's so much more that we could have talked about here. There's obviously the deregulatory. We didn't even get to those parts, right? Inactive fleet, deregulatory activities, legislative proposals. One thing that I do want to say that I think is critically important for this whole maritime push is we have to have, whether it's the Ships Act in its current form or not, we have to have a legislative arm. We have to have legislation go through, because one of the things, being up here in the Massachusetts area, that I find different in the offshore wind discussion to this, and not speaking to any of the industries, but that this can't change as quickly with a new administration if it's solidified in law, right? And so that's why this Ships Act is so critical, because it is different than any of the offshore wind movement. Because offshore wind was admittedly good for building new vessels for the U.S. fleet, because we were doing some installation vessels, and it was starting to get that idea going. This is leaps and bounds, and we just need to make sure that that's part of these long-term plans, right? Long-term investments. You're not going to get those long-term investments with confidence as wide as we need it if we don't have that kind of that solidified, this won't change in a few years.
I think the way I would, I guess, wrap it up on my side, there's a lot about the inactive ready reserve fleet that is exciting. Again, like, let's make it happen now. But on the actual regulation piece of what they go through, I worked on an LNG project a few years ago. Coast Guard was a fantastic partner. ABS was a fantastic partner. But the general consensus was we can't change the CFRs. That would take almost an act of God. And so let's figure out how to do it this way. And there is a lot of language at the end of the doc talking about let's look at this NAVIC, let's look at how
Mhm.
we change the CFR. And so it's like
Mhm.
we might finally be at that moment where we can course correct on some of these things that we've been having weird workarounds for,
Yeah.
to do it right, because we do have, right, that congressional support from, bipartisan support, Ships for America's Act, and what will that play out to be?
I think that's right. It feels like there's been a lot of, that's going to be really hard, so let's figure it out, like you're saying.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
right now, we're in this who cares if it's hard? What's
Mm.
the best idea?
Yep.
Like, what are the best ideas and what will make this a long term success? So,
Yeah. Cool.
initial impressions up, down, medium. What do you think?
Definitely up. No, positive on my side. Now, it'd just be nice to see the funding that they talk about, these massive pots of money, start to come down in some, responsible way.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I would agree. I think overall, I'm pretty jazzed about this. I think that this is going to be great ideas. I wasn't sure how robust the Maritime Action Plan was
Mhm.
going to be. We've had other initiatives in years past, and right, this now is not what happened years past. That came down and it was only 10 pages. This is 41
Mm.
pages. This is
Yeah.
more than an outline. This
Yeah.
is robust enough to give us a really good starting point. Whereas, before the executive order was the outline, and then
Mm.
here's step two, and I think step three will ultimately be a national maritime strategy, and I'm excited to see that start to get into play. So, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank
Like I said, it's
you.
been about an hour and 10 minutes we've been talking. That's about as long as we had to prep for this conversation on talking about this document. So, appreciate your initial impressions here. And how can people get a hold of you?
You can find us at ness-c, so ness-sea.com. There's a contact form, and we're happy to have conversations. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
Perfect. You are my shipbuilding expert. I'm so happy that you were able to join me today. Thank
It was
you
good to catch up.
so much.
Have a great weekend.
All right. Well, that's it. A live show that is truly live in pretty much all regards. This was about as present sense impression as you can get on this document. We like I said, only had about 45 minutes to an hour to review it. We could have done the AI route and summarized it, but clearly we didn't because we were remembering the parts we were reading. Caitlin had it printed out. I had it on my PDF here with highlights on it. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. I hope this was helpful. I hope this gives you a first step, a first thought on how this Maritime Action Plan might have some benefits, some context to some of the ideas here. But that's what we really wanted to do today, was just give a little bit of a. We were going to have this conversation anyways. We were happy to have you along. For the most part, I think that our impressions are going to stick on these, but forgive us if they don't. Forgive us if we learn a little bit more and we have a little bit of a different idea. But overall, I think our positivity on this document is going to stay, and I'm so encouraged by where we're going. And let's keep going, guys. I think this is going to get moving fast now for Maritime. All right. Well, if you like this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review. Want to go deeper on these topics or bring this kind of insight to your team? Visit themaritimeprofessor.com to explore corporate trainings, tailored briefings, and on-demand webinars, all designed to make complex maritime regulations practical and easy to understand. And if your organization needs help navigating the legal or strategic side of ocean shipping regulations, head over to Squall Strategies. That's where I provide consulting services, regulatory guidance, and policy support across the global supply chain. And if you need shipbuilding support, check out Nessie with Caitlin Hardy. As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. Until next time, I'm Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.